Hi, everybody, and welcome to Nelson Primary's webinar on Teaching the NAIDOC Week 2024 theme, Using Our Land, Our Stories. I'll give it just a moment or so as people continue to join us. All right, before we jump in and get started, I'll just quickly take you through some housekeeping. If you have any questions that come up during the webinar, please pop these into the Q&A function along the bottom of your screen. We will respond either during the session or we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar. If you have any technical issues, please pop these in the chat function. Finally, this webinar is being recorded today, and you will receive a copy of the recording in about a week's time. I will now introduce you to our presenter, Danielle Shaw. Danielle's extensive experience as a classroom teacher, spanning over 2 decades, has led her to specialize in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education. She has also contributed to the Our Land, Our Story series, focusing on First Nations across Australia. She also provides professional learning opportunities to schools Australia-wide through engaging live webinars. Over to you, Danielle.
Great, thank you. Kai, hello to everyone out there. I'm coming to you from Awabakal country in Lake Macquarie, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and acknowledge those who have walked this land before us. May we always tread carefully on Aboriginal country. And if you'd like to, please put in the chat function the Aboriginal country or the land of the traditional owners that your school is located on. Okay, in today's webinar, we are using Our Land, Our Stories to coincide with the 2024 NAIDOC theme, Keep the Fire Burning, Black, Loud and Proud. National NAIDOC Week celebrations are held across Australia in the first week of July each year to celebrate and recognise the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's an opportunity for all Australians to learn about First Nations cultures and histories and participate in celebrations of the oldest continuous living cultures on Earth. Okay, and when we look at the official NAIDOC.org website, we read that this year's theme celebrates the unyielding spirit of communities and invites all to stand in solidarity, amplifying the voices that have long been silenced. Now, I have found this year's theme quite open to interpretation, so the pathway I've taken in this webinar may be a different perspective to what you may have perceived within the theme. For me, I see 3 elements which I will focus on in today's webinar. Okay, and for the first focus, we have Keep the Fire Burning. It reads from the website, the fire represents the enduring strength and vitality of Indigenous cultures passed down through generations despite the challenges faced. So in this first focus, we will use stories from Our Land, Our Stories to explore and celebrate the cultural heritage of our nation, the oldest living culture in the world. And through these stories, students will develop their understanding of First Nations Australians' connection to the land, to each other, and to the rich tapestry of traditions that define Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the second focus I have taken for today's webinar also aligns with Keep the Fire Burning, and we will again be exploring the cultural heritage of our nation and how, as we honour this flame, we are igniting a renewed commitment to acknowledging, preserving and sharing the cultural heritage that enriches our nation. Now, with this, I have really connected with how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared. And we will use Our Land, Our Stories to explore this through elements of oral storytelling, art, dance, literature, music, design and media. And the third focus to the theme is Black, Loud and Proud. And when we look at NAIDOC.org, it reads Black, Loud and Proud encapsulates the unapologetic celebration of Indigenous identity, empowering us to stand tall in our heritage and assert our place in the modern world. So today we will use Our Land, Our Stories to investigate inspirational Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are standing tall in their heritage and asserting their place in the modern world. Okay. And by building their cultural competency and awareness through these stories and through using a top tier resource like Our Land, Our Stories, which features 39 First Nations authors, students and teachers are also contributing to the call from this year's theme of a reclamation of narratives, an amplification of voices, and an unwavering commitment to justice and equality. Okay, focus 1. Keep the fire burning and using Our Land, Our Stories to explore and celebrate First Nations Australians' connection to the land, to each other, and to the rich tapestry of traditions that define Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Okay, now first we'll look at the story What is Country by Joanne Crawford from page 3 of the Middle Primary Country and Place Big Book. Now this story offers a great summary of what constitutes a place being the country to which you belong and how this links to Indigenous Australians' identity. Students also learn how the word country defines values, respect and beliefs, and also how one person's relationship to country is different to another person's. What is Country also speaks to the notion of identity with a great student-friendly explanation about how an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person's identity is closely connected to where they come from, their country, their family and their community. We then learn how Aboriginal Australians are connected to land with beliefs and laws for living through the dreaming, as well as the story of Tagai for the Torres Strait Islander peoples. Okay, and page 3 from the Middle Primary Student Activity Book, we can see so many activities that help students reflect on what they've learnt. I especially love questions 2 and 3, where students are guided to connect with their local Aboriginal country and where they feel they belong. Now, this especially resonates with me as attending many meetings with many knowledgeable elders and community members. I have learnt from them the importance of guiding students to make these connections with their own local Aboriginal community, which I believe Our Land, Our Stories does exceptionally well throughout the whole series. Okay, and moving on to the next story, we were going to look at is First Peoples and Their Cultures by Carmel Riley from page 3 of the Middle Primary Culture Big Book. Now, I've used this story many times with students, and it gives such a great student-friendly summary of what culture is, building students' understanding of this 2024 NAIDOC theme. Students go on to learn that when the British arrived in the 1780s, there were hundreds of Aboriginal nations around the country. People belonging to each of these nations had their own cultures with language, ideas, customs, and way of life. Students also learn of Torres Strait Islander cultures and how these islands broke away from Papua New Guinea about 8,000 years ago, and there are now 2 main languages spoken in the Torres Strait. And here we have the student activities from page 22 of the Middle Primary Student Activity Book. Now, I love question 3 and 4, where students are not only guided to acknowledge the Aboriginal country they are familiar with, but to also use the AITSIS Indigenous map to investigate other places they have visited and perhaps haven't necessarily considered the Aboriginal nation they were on. This takes students a step further with real life experiences to bridge that understanding that hundreds of Aboriginal nations span the entire Australian continent. And moving on, I would then look at Connection to Country by Kate Hadwood on page 4 of the Upper Primary Country and Place Big Book. This story really exemplifies the 2024 NAIDOC theme, Keep the Fire Burning. The story starts by defining what it means for Australia to have the oldest living civilization on Earth, with Aboriginal nations having their own ideas, cultures, laws, and distinct languages. It then explains how the notion of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, is grossly inaccurate, and how Aboriginal peoples altered the landscape in sophisticated ways over thousands of years using methods like fire stick farming. We are also offered explanation of the Torres Strait Islanders' cultures, languages and practices, and how these differ across the Eastern and Western Island groups. We also learn how their flag represents the strong connection Torres Strait Islanders have with land, sea and sky. Okay, and the activities from page 7 of the Middle Primary Student Activity Book. And I love question 1A, where students are given the opportunity to demonstrate what they know about how expertly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples inhabited the land before European arrival. And question 2, where students can use visual representations to identify the different environments across the Torres Strait. All right. From here, we can then look at the middle primary connection to country story from the Country and Place Big Book. Now, being a middle primary story, it targets a slightly different audience than the upper primary, but still offers very significant content to meet that NAIDOC theme of celebrating our cultural heritage. Now, this story explains the sacred sites within connection to country and how sacred sites are often linked to the dreaming. Students then learn about totems and how totems or special objects or symbols are sacred to the individual people they belong to within spirituality and forms a large part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Students also learn how traditions, beliefs, and sacred stories are very important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which may tell about the land, the laws, and customs. Okay, and activities from page 7 of the middle primary student activity book. Now, I love question 1 as by identifying key elements from these sites, it reiterates to students that there are numerous sites all over Australia which are sacred to those belonging to that area. And through this, students build their understanding that even though we see a lot about Uluru and other well-known magnificent sites in published media or online, they are not the only or necessarily most sacred sites in Australia. Every Aboriginal nation has their most sacred sites on or near their country that they are connected to. And quite similar to this story is Country from page 6 of the middle primary culture big book. Now, this story explains that First Nations people's identity is linked with strong connections to the land, seas and waterways where their family come from. It also speaks of identity as everything on country, being connected to everything else. You are a part of it, just as the hills, rivers, native animals and plants are a part of it. And of course, learning about this complexity of identity sits beautifully within the NAIDOC theme of celebrating cultural heritage. Students then learn how, rather than calling themselves Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, many people prefer to describe themselves as coming from their particular country, such as Wiradjuri or Awabakal. Students learn of spiritual connections through totems, kinship and laws, and how totems help people to understand their kinship with others in their group and to know what laws they must follow. Okay, and I love this activity from page 23 of the middle primary student activity book. And within the story Country, we've learnt of the importance of identity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And here we can see the activities provide students with the opportunity to deepen that understanding by considering their own cultural identity and how this impacts the experiences they have in their lives. All right, and the next story we're going to look at is Caring for Country from page 15 of the middle primary Country and Place big book. Now, this story shares valuable information and I recommend it as a one-stop shop to foster an understanding of culture and connection to country as part of NAIDOC 2024 Keep the Fire Burning. This story talks of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's deep respect for and responsibility to maintaining country as it was given to them by the ancestral beings of the dreaming. Sorry. It also explores how vast knowledge of various plants and animals within an area was developed and how to use this for food and medicines. Students learn that knowledge of sustainable practices has been passed down through generations and ensured food supplies were always abundant. And students explore the generational importance of seasons within connection to land, sea and sky, linked with the dreaming, and how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples understand the seasons in different ways to the traditional 4 seasons of the calendar year that we're familiar with. It's also how some Aboriginal peoples have used different signs and environmental indicators to track the seasons. We also learn the importance for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to continue to feel connected to country. Okay, activities on page 9 of the middle primary student activity book are as comprehensive as the information from the story. Question 1 is guiding students to recognise the vast diversity of Australian landscapes and environments. Question 4, and students explore the diversity of the seasons and how they are read by different Aboriginal nations across the country. And questions 2, 3, 5 and 6 are guiding students to reflect on the importance of connection, knowledge of and caring for country as part of sustainable practice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Okay, now the story Land, Island, River and Sea by Lisa Fuller from the Upper Primary Culture Big Book, which again explores the cultural heritage of our nation. However, this story gives us that perspective of how this has been achieved despite the challenges faced. Because this story encapsulates the whole essence of this part of the NAIDOC theme so well, I would also certainly recommend this story when looking at Keep the Fire Burning. Students learn of First Nations Australians' soul deep connection to country and how in the past ceremonies and traditions would take care of country just as country would take care of them. Students learn about the impacts of invasion on maintaining connection to country and how some nations have been able to keep many of these caring practices while others are slowly bringing them back. Students also learn of the sadness and pain as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have never willingly given up their country to Europeans and refuse to give it up still. This story then informs about the welcome to country tradition linked with caring for country. Okay, and the activities from page 47 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book really bring together the content from the story. Question 1, and students are guided to unpack this strong connection to country for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and how this is maintained when living away from country. And question 2, students are given open-ended opportunities to showcase their understanding of the important difference between a welcome to country and an acknowledgement of country. Okay, this next story, The Dreaming, from page 10 of the Middle Primary Culture Big Book, exemplifies beautifully how First Nations Australians' connection to the land and to each other, linked within the dreaming, orchestrates the rich tapestry of traditions that define Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This story links language within the huge complexities of the dreaming and explains how dreaming stories have been handed down over thousands of years, which tell how the world and everything in it was created. These stories set out laws, religious beliefs, and customs for each nation to follow. Students will explore that dreaming stories keep connections strong between the past and the present, and each group has its own oral histories which shape the art, dances, and songs of each culture. It also explains that dreaming stories tell of how the ancestor spirits moved across the land, creating the hills, valleys, animals, and plants. We also learned that across the Torres Strait Islands, there are many stories about how the world was created, and the story of Tagai tells of how the constellations and stars were created. We learned that when the British arrived in Australia, there were more than 250 First Nations languages, and most people learned to speak several languages, so they were able to speak to neighbouring groups as well. Today, communities are working hard to revitalise all these languages. And the activities from page 25 of the Middle Primary Student Activity Book, and we can see with question 1, students are able to develop their understanding with a closed activity about the dreaming. Now, teaching across multiple schools and supporting teachers' cultural competency as well, I make a big point of students and teachers recognising that the dreaming and dreaming stories are exceptionally complex within culture. Now, to have a true conception of the intricate complexity and connection within the dreaming, in my opinion, is really only held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are fortunate enough to be quite immersed in their culture by knowledge holders. Now, this deep level of understanding of the dreaming is something I know I will never have, and neither will most educators. And that's okay. My Western influenced perspective doesn't have to understand it, and it would be ignorant of me to think that I could. It's important to just recognise the depth of this complexity, as all too often the dreaming can be inaccurately simplified by educators into mere stories that explain how something came to be, like how the birds got their colours. Okay, so we will now move into the second component of Keep the Fire Burning with Focus 2. And so far we have explored and celebrated how the fire represents the enduring strength and vitality of Indigenous cultures passed down through generations despite the challenges faced. Now, we will explore how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared within honouring this flame from Keep the Fire Burning. Now, this story, oral storytelling from page 23 of the Upper Primary Culture Big Book really complements the previous story, The Dreaming. It explores how cultural knowledge is acknowledged, preserved and shared through oral histories, but with more focus on Aboriginal languages and revitalisation of these since British colonialisation. Students learn how many Western cultures place a lot of importance on written documents and records as the most trustworthy way to research Australia's shared history. However, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures depend on oral history traditions where stories are passed down, with each important story being carefully told many times. And we learn that both written and oral history are equally important ways of learning about our history. Yet because these stories are not written down, it takes researchers like anthropologists and archaeologists finding proof before other people may believe it. Students also learned that because language wasn't written down, many Europeans made up their own spelling from hearing how things were said aloud. Now, what they wrote down was usually wrong, as the only knowledge they had to make sense of this new culture was based on their own culture, which led to a lot of misunderstanding. Language has always been integral for Aboriginal identities and cultures, and with the work being done to revitalise and reawaken many languages, we see the perfect example of enduring strength and vitality of Indigenous cultures through language. Okay, and you can see here the engaging activities from page 48 of the upper primary student activity book. And I love question 1, which scaffolds students to recognise the difference between storytelling for First Nations Australians and in Western cultures. And the open-ended question 3, where students consider the continuing impact, mistakes and other misunderstandings by Europeans have today. And question 4, where students have opportunity to showcase their understanding of these continuing impacts and how we can move forward to rectify these. So the next story we're going to look at within Keep the Fire Burning, NAIDOC 2024, is Art and Performance from page 14 of the Middle Primary Culture Big Book. Now, as the fire symbolises, this story speaks of the connection to the land, to each other, and how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Students learn that art and performance are important ways for people to connect and pass on their culture from generation to generation. They also learn that music in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures can be performed as part of ceremonies and within communities to pass on knowledge. Also, how it may be used for sacred and religious ceremonies, or there may be public music gatherings or corroborees for entertainment and also to share stories. This story then explains how dance is also a way to pass on knowledge and stories. Students learn that, like music, some dances are a part of sacred ceremonies and only seen by a few people, while others are enjoyed by everyone. Moving on, and students are given information about contemporary dance theatre Bangarra, which is celebrated all over the world for its powerful performances. Story then explores visual arts, which connects people to country and the dreaming, as well as 40,000-year-old rock art by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which may signify sacred places. We also learn that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples may paint their bodies and totems with totems and symbols for ceremonies and for dance performances. Students are also presented with the evolution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander painting since the 1900s and how many art forms are now used to express culture, and how many First Nations artists can express their culture also through writing and making films and television programs. Okay, now because this story, Art and Performance, is so comprehensive and covers so much content on how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared, there is equally many corresponding activities from page 26 of the Middle Primary Student Activity Book. And I love these activities, which give students open-ended opportunities to showcase their understanding of the story, particularly in creative ways like questions 4, 6, 7 and 8, where children can represent their understanding using visuals and drawing. Okay, and you can then progress to the Middle Primary Culture Reading Card, Dance, Keeping Culture Alive by Jill McDougall. And again, this story speaks of how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared as part of Keep the Fire Burning. It starts by explaining how dancers tell stories that connect people to their land, their history and their ancestors. Students are offered information about a dance college near Sydney where young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people learn all about aspects of dance. Students are also given more information about Bangarra Dance Theatre and how it encourages their students to continue to feel proud of their cultures. Okay, in the activities on page 36 of the middle primary student activity book, and I really love question 2, where students are scaffolded to make connections between the story and their own lives. And question 3, where students are asked to visualise the song Taba Naba and represent how this looks for them. Okay, now next story is art, this time from the upper primary culture big book. Now, like the similar story from the middle primary culture big book, exploring how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared through art, this story also informs students of fake art and art appropriation. And it starts by explaining how art practices are as different across the country as the cultures and peoples are. And that is because art is a cultural product, something you produce that is influenced by your culture. Students learn that different regions have specific styles and symbols, and traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's art will tell a story. Students learn that in the past and continuing today, a lot of art has been stolen and used without the permission of the artist, with a huge market to produce and sell fake art. Now, of course, this does not respect the strong traditions and importance of art in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives, and it also robs artists of much needed and deserved income. And again, the activities from page 49 of the upper primary student activity book, and question 1 here is guiding students to consider and interpret the beautiful artwork from the front cover of the upper primary big book and how this is an example of authentic Aboriginal art, particularly with the information about the artwork also within the big book on page 1. All 9 of the Our Land, Our Stories series big books feature extraordinary artworks on the front cover with corresponding information about the artwork and artists that can be used for many quality and culturally appropriate learning experiences. And questions 3 and 4 that reiterate to students how harmful fake art is, especially when considering art is a form of how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared. Okay, now this next story is from the upper primary culture big book, and again, it complements the stories from the middle primary series. Here we look at literature from page 27 of the upper primary culture big book. So, literature, I love the beginning of this story that reads, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are storytellers in all shapes and forms, including through music and poetry. Storytelling is at the heart of our cultures, so when the Europeans brought literature and film to our lives, we took that up as well. Now, in this story, students learn that Bennelong was the first Aboriginal man to learn to write, and that writing is a tool for activism where many used writings to protest about the conditions that their people were living under. And more recently, First Nations Australian writers have become better recognised for the brilliance of their work, with many winning prestigious awards, like Alexis Wright, who recently won the Stella Prize again earlier this year. Students learn how oral history traditions known as circular conversations can also be present in modern writing, which is where you may talk all the way around a topic before coming back to it. All right, and the student activities on page 50 of the upper primary student activity book. And I love question 1, where students are given an open-ended opportunity to reflect on the contributions Bennelong made to his people through writing. And question 2 and 3, where students can learn more about the extraordinary man and author, Bruce Pascoe, who has made amazing contributions with sharing cultural heritage through his writing and teachings. All right. And much like literature being a modern expression and acknowledgement of culture and identity, so too is the media. In this upper primary reading card by Jill McDougall titled Indigenous Media, students learn that First Nations media is media controlled and produced by First Nations peoples and is an important way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to maintain and strengthen their cultural knowledge. Students learned that in the early days of Australian radio, television and film, First Nations peoples were rarely seen or heard in the media. The card explores the 1955 film Jeddah, which was the first to feature Aboriginal actors in leading roles. Now, the film features actors from Aboriginal nations in the Northern Territory, and the people from this area felt that the filmmakers did not understand or respect their cultures. Films like Jeddah, which perpetuate stereotypes, show why it is important for First Nations peoples to have a say in how their culture is portrayed in the media. And the card also investigates how, until the 1970s, most radio and television shows ignored the existence of Indigenous Australians, and it was at this time that First Nations Australians began to find ways to use the media to protect and strengthen their culture. Students learned that the first Aboriginal television station was established in 1985, and now people like Rachel Perkins, who is the daughter of Charles Perkins from the Freedom Rides, has established her own winning and amazing production company and made many award-winning documentaries and films. We see that television and digital media is a way for many First Nations organisations to instantly reach a wider audience and share, acknowledge and preserve their cultural heritage, which enriches our whole nation. Okay, and the corresponding activities from page 85 of the upper primary student activity book. And I love questions 1 and 2, which guide students to consider how negative portrayals of First Nations Australians in early media could have contributed to society stereotypes. And another open-ended opportunity with the last question, which guides students to consider how media owned and operated by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has helped to protect and strengthen First Nations cultures in more recent years. And this question is perfect to explore how cultural heritage is acknowledged, preserved and shared in contemporary times using media. Okay, and now music and dance from page 28 of the Upper Primary Culture Big Book. In this story, students learn that, like art and literature, music and dance are cultural products that differ between cultures and is yet another pathway for cultural heritage to be acknowledged, preserved and shared. Students learn that songwriting is an important contemporary way for First Nations Australians to express themselves, as music gives a platform to share stories and understand each other. The story speaks of how, like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander music, dance is another form of storytelling and a way to continue connection between country and ancestors. Different dances have different purposes and a deeper meaning than many non-Indigenous Australians realise. It also introduces students to the Torres Strait Islander dari, a traditional headdress that is used in ceremony throughout the islands. Students learn they are often created by men and can differ depending on what the creator wishes to say in the dance. All right, and we can see here all the corresponding activities from page 51 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book. And again, so many engaging open-ended opportunities here for students to reflect on the story and show their understanding of music and dance as ways to acknowledge, preserve and share culture. And I love how question 2 ties in with the NAIDOC theme by asking students to give their own explanation of how music and dance are forms of cultural storytelling. Okay, and the next story, festivals and celebrations from the Middle Primary Culture Big Book, really links with Keep the Fire Burning and speaks of how the traditions that define Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is acknowledged, preserved and shared through these festivals and celebrations, especially through NAIDOC. This story explains that celebrations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures take place throughout the year, and these may include celebrating arts and Aboriginal culture in the Yabin Festival in Sydney, the Deadly Funny competition as part of the Comedy Festival in Melbourne, or the Gama Festival of the Yolngu people's culture in Arnhem Land. And of course, for me, as a specialist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teacher across multiple schools, the annual celebration of NAIDOC Week is a huge celebration within my schools. Now, while I involve local community as much as I can throughout the whole year, I really love NAIDOC. This is a week where schools celebrations this is a week I love for my school celebrations, as I'm fortunate to be able to bring in many local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge holders to run workshops for all my students. And this is another really important thing for NAIDOC Week, or really any other cultural celebration. It's paramount to involve all of your students at your school, not just your First Nations students. And involving community in your celebrations is essential, forming the perfect partnership when exploring cultural celebrations using our land, our stories. Okay, and page 3 of the middle primary student activity book. And I love here how students have opportunity to showcase what their school does to recognise significant cultural ideas and celebrations. This is so important as part of culturally inclusive education and exemplifies that acknowledging, preserving and sharing events like this is everybody's business. Okay, in focus 3, we will use our land, our stories to investigate inspirational First Nations Australians who are standing tall in their heritage and asserting their place in the modern world as part of Blak, Loud and Proud, encapsulating the unapologetic celebration of Indigenous identity. Now, one thing that our land, our stories does exceptionally well is celebrate historical and contemporary inspirational Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And today I will present these stories firstly from a middle primary series and then from the upper primary series. And the first story we will look at in this focus is My Connection to Country from page 20 of the middle primary Country and Place Big Book. This story explains there are many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been successful in their careers and continue to maintain a deep connection to their country. Students learn about Jessica Mauboy and how many of her songs have a special meaning for her and her ancestral country in the Northern Territory. About Edward Koiki-Mava, who believed that First Nations Australians should be treated equally. And because of him, the laws about land rights were changed and are still in place today. About the athletic successes of Kathy Freeman and also her passion for the work of the Kathy Freeman Foundation that focuses on education and pathways for First Nations students from pre-prep to year 12. And about Phil Narkle, a Noongar man who had a very successful career in the AFL and who now works as an Indigenous liaison officer for the West Coast Eagles Football Club in Western Australia. Okay, and page 11 of the middle primary student activity book, and we can see here activities that guide students to use their own creativity in showcasing their understanding of how these inspirational First Nations Australians celebrate and maintain their deep connection to their country. Okay, and we now have the middle primary reading card, Stand Grant by Ruth Stark. Now, I absolutely love proud Wiradjuri man Stan Grant and his 2016 Australian Dream speech. Now, if you have not seen this speech, please Google it and then share it with your staff and then share it with everyone you know. Stan Grant is the epitome of an inspirational First Nations Australian, standing tall in their heritage and encapsulating the unapologetic celebration of Indigenous identity. In this card, students learn that Stan Grant is an award-winning journalist who has worked all over the world, and it shares how he came from very humble beginnings within a poor family and amidst racism from his peers. But students learn in this card how Stan Grant worked hard to become a nationally acclaimed reporter and how other First Nations Australians supported him along the way. The story also informs about books he has authored and how he is an ambassador for the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. And page 61 of the middle primary student activity book, and we can see some really engaging questions like 1 and 2, which help deepen students' understanding of what life may have been like for Stan Grant growing up amidst racism and the embarrassment that he felt about being Aboriginal, even though he had an ancestor who was a great warrior. And questions like 5 and 6, again, such thought-provoking questions that challenge students to consider what they have read in the card about Stan Grant's achievements and his life experiences. Okay, now also from the middle primary series is the reading card Adam Goods by Jill McDougall, which has a very similar tone to the previous Stan Grant card as an Aboriginal man unapologetically standing tall in their heritage. Students learn how Adam Goods is a champion AFL player who captained the Sydney Swans and won the Brownlow medal twice. Students also read of his journey to learn more about his Aboriginal heritage. We learn of the community work Adam has done since retiring from football, particularly in the space of tackling racism and the Go Foundation, which helps to give First Nations children a quality education. And students learn that within this community work, Adam Goods was aptly awarded as the 2014 Australian of the Year. Okay, and the activities on page 55 of the Middle Primary Student Activity Book. And I love question 4, where students can demonstrate their understanding of the impacts of racism, and question 5, where students are asked why they think Adam Goodes deserved to win the Australian of the Year award. I also love question 6, where there is a QR link for students to view Adam Goodes and his remarkable response to that racism incident he experienced on the field when playing against Collingwood in 2013. Students are then guided to reflect on this with an activity on unity and celebrating diversity. Okay, you are now going to explore one of my very favourite stories from the entire Our Land, Our Stories resource, Hip Hop and Rap Telling Our Stories by Carl Neurenfeld and Denzel Baker and Patrick Mao, which is an upper primary culture reading card. Now, contemporary music is such a powerful way to connect with others, and the rap artists in this reading card use their music to assert their place in the world with an unapologetic celebration of their Indigenous identity, encapsulating the NAIDOC theme, Black, Loud and Proud. This card starts by sharing with students that for thousands of years, storytelling has and continues to be a central part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, with some people being honoured as the keeper of words. They learn that story writing and singing are kinds of storytelling, and different musical styles can be used to tell stories in different ways. The card then goes on to explore two innovative, sorry, I always struggle with that word, successful First Nations hip hop and rap artists, Denzel Baker, better known by his hip hop name Baker Boy, and Patrick Mao, better known as Mao Power. Now, I've used this card many times with students, and like myself, they also love it as it explores how the cultures of these artists influence their music, as well as how it is celebrated. And the corresponding activities from page 61 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book complement the highly engaging content of this reading card. And I love question 1, where students can draw links between the ancient tradition of being the keeper of words with modern hip hop and rap artists. And question 3 and 5, where students are provided with QR code links to view and respond to the music video for Baker Boy's song Cloud 9, which is filmed in his home community in the Northern Territory, and also of his speech when he received the 2019 Young Australian of the Year award. Okay, the next story that explores how inspirational First Nations Australians are standing tall in their heritage is Artists from page 24 of the Upper Primary People Big Book, written by Jill McDougall. Students learn that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have frequently led the way when it comes to new forms of art, music, dancing, and storytelling, deepening that connection to culture and country. This story celebrates Albert Nemanjira, an Arunti man from Central Australia, who is considered one of Australia's greatest painters, and Alec Tipoti, a world-renowned artist from Badu Island in Western Torres Strait. Students learn of Richard Maynard, a Tasmanian photographer whose art tells stories about the unwavering spirit of Aboriginal Tasmanians and the intergenerational trauma they have experienced due to colonisation. This story delves into performing arts and how, with a modern context, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to tell stories and teach values through ceremony, song, dance, and storytelling. Students also learn of music and how before the 1970s, only a few musicians, Indigenous musicians like Georgia Lee and Jamie Little, managed to gain recognition. It also celebrates many contemporary Indigenous musicians like Archie Roach, Ruby Hunter and Yothu Yindi. And again, students are extended with activities from page 73 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book that help reiterate the NAIDOC theme of First Nations Australians being Black, Loud and Proud. And I love hearing question 1, how students are given a QR code to learn more about the artist Alec Tipoti and his partnership with Prince Albert II of Morocco, after the two men connected and found a shared passion on climate change. And question 2, where students are also given a QR code link to view and reflect on photographs from well-known photographer Richard Maynard. Okay, leading on from our previous story, we have contemporary Indigenous artists, a reading card from the People Upper Primary series, written by Anna Carrick and Shane Nelson from the National Gallery of Australia. And students learn in this card that the designs, patterns and stories that appear in Indigenous art were handed down by the ancestors. And within this card, students learn about numerous Aboriginal artists and their inspirational pieces, many of whom you can see here on your screen. And the student activities from page 81 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book. And we can see so many opportunities here for students to really interpret and appreciate these artists and the importance of their artworks in being Black, loud and proud. And I love question 8 that asks students to draw a picture that they feel represents an important part of their life, just as the artist features in this card have made artworks that tell stories about the land, the dreaming and events they have a connection to. Okay, next we have Young Achievers from page 27 of the Upper Primary People Big Book. And this story also celebrates young achievers who are standing tall in their heritage and asserting their place in the modern world. Okay, this story also features people like Chris Temway from the Torres Strait, who was watched by millions in 2016 as the Australia's Got Talent Grand Final, and Amanda Reid, an Australian Paralympian. And we can see here the activities from page 75 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book help students connect with what they've learned about these inspirational Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young achievers. Okay, and our last story that we will look at today is Role Models Breaking New Ground from page 20 of the Upper Primary People Big Book. This story celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have become role models for other Indigenous Australians, leading the way in new areas of endeavour. Students learn of Patricia O'Shane. She's a Kanjani woman from northern Queensland who drew strength from racism she experienced as a child, and in the 1960s became the first female Aboriginal teacher in Queensland. She went on to become the first Aboriginal person in the country to earn a law degree and the first Aboriginal magistrate in New South Wales local law court. And if that's not enough, this magnificent woman was also the first woman in Australia to become head of a government department. Now, with so many amazing accomplishments, Patricia O'Shane is the epitome of Black, loud and proud, someone unapologetically empowered by their Indigenous identity, standing tall in their heritage and asserting their place in the modern world. Students also learn of Shirley Smith, who in the 1930s became the driving force behind many new services for Aboriginal people. They also learn of Noongar woman Dr. Sandra Eads, who is a leading medical researcher in Western Australia, and Dr. Kelvin Kong, who is Australia's first Indigenous surgeon specialising in ear, nose and throat surgery. Okay, and with the activities from page 71 of the Student Activity Book, students are guided to reflect on the information they have learnt. And I love how these questions not only ask about the young achievers' accomplishments, but also about the challenges they face and overcame, as well as their personal attributes. Now, this reiterates how identity has helped guide their achievements as they unapologetically stand tall in their cultural heritage. Okay, now that brings us to the end of our webinar, just a tiny bit over time, sorry. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I hope you feel a bit more informed about using our land, our stories to recognise NAIDOC 2024 and keep the fire burning Black, loud and proud. Now, again, I'm very proud of the recent launch of my new business, 5emus Consultancy and Resources, which I do run alongside my teaching roles. So if you are looking for some whole school professional learning in how to use our land, our stories in a quality way, as well as much, much more, please jump over to our website, www.5emus.net.au. Now, I've already had such a great response from so many schools, and particularly with helping schools develop a better understanding of using our land, our stories, and look forward to helping many more. Great. Thank you. Over to you, Benito.
Thanks, Danielle. And thanks again to everyone for joining us today. We hope you found it useful. To support you and your students to bring NAIDOC Week celebrations into your classroom, we're currently offering 20% off our Land Our Stories for the month of June using the discount code up on this slide there. If you'd like to view any of the Our Land Our Stories resources, please do get in touch with your local Nelson Learning consultant for an appointment. They're always happy to help. As mentioned earlier, you will receive a recording of this webinar in about a week's time. And thank you again for joining us today, and have a lovely evening.